The first Old Testament prologue of the season, a surprisingly in-depth reading of 2 Samuel 12:15-23, may be found in Episode 3. As we resume the story, David has been fasting and praying for days after his first son with Bathsheba became ill as a result of David's transgression. His advisors are concerned about David's health and what might happen to them if they let him deteriorate. David gets ready to eat and worship the Lord after learning of the child's death through Bathsheba's cries. He tells Bathsheba that while there was still hope, he fasted. But since the kid has passed away, fasting is useless. David is at a loss for words when Bathsheba asks him why the Lord has heard his prayers so many other times, but not now. The episode opens with Quintus furious. He is aware that his position is in jeopardy and that his tax figures are declining. Furious that Gaius has not followed his orders to make life hard for Jesus' disciples, he threatens to demote him if he does not shrink the tent city by 10 cubits every day. Later, when the public dispute between Jesus and the Pharisees starts to attract attention, Gaius tells Matthew to get Jesus out while he watches the audience from the sidelines. Upon observing the events, Atticus requests that Gaius inform Quintus that his future with Rome will depend on the resolution of the disturbance. As Atticus realizes that Gaius is planning another riot in order to frame Quintus for it, he cautions Gaius that he is playing a risky game and that only one of them, Quintus or Gaius, will make it out alive. Quintus gives Gaius the command to arrest Jesus when he eventually shows up. Quintus has Gaius arrested because he won't comply with his commands. Quintus then draws his sword and steps out into the throng. He kills Rema by accidentally stabbing him while trying to capture some of the disciples. Atticus, who also appears repulsed, appears to arrest Quintus and carry him away. Quintus is shocked and horrified at killing a woman. Thomas meets Rema under Andrew's careful eye and presents her with a legitimate betrothal gift, a sundial. He explains that it makes him think of how, whenever he's with her, he always loses track of time and wants to spend eternity with her. Inspired by Eden's advice, Rama wants to discuss more about marriage. She responds that Thomas is not like Simon and that there are aspects of marriage that apply to everyone, particularly to those who are pursuing the unique calling of following Jesus. Thomas and Rama are split apart when the disciples start to run away from the public discussion between Jesus and the Pharisees, which is getting out of hand. Quintus stabs Rama by mistake as he pulls his sword to strike the disciples. She finally says something to Thomas, pushing him to stay with Jesus as he rushes to her side. Thomas begs Jesus to heal her when he arrives, but Jesus maintains that now is not the time for healing. The leader of the local synagogue, Rabbi Akiva, tells his students to follow the directive from Jerusalem and try to trap Jesus so they may accuse him of blasphemy. Jairus listens uncomfortably. They are in the best position to condemn Jesus, he maintains, because he is a necromancer. In order to get Jesus ready for his impending speech, Mary Magdalene makes him eat. Jesus argues that the people require direction because they are being led incompetently. Simon acknowledges that Jesus' preaching is a bad idea, but he doesn't think they can stop Jesus, according to Matthew, who has relayed Gaius' warning. Jesus is not deterred despite Shula and Barnaby's warnings about the injunction outside the synagogue. They introduce him to Uzziah, one of their friends who has been blind since birth. A guy on the street asks Jesus if his parents or his own sin is what led him to become blind, as Jesus gets ready to heal him. Jesus clarifies that the blindness is an opportunity for him to exalt God rather than a result of sin, John 9. As Jesus cures the man by applying mud to his eyes and washing it away, a local Pharisee observes with great interest. He tells Rabbi Akiva that Jesus is healing on the Sabbath, which infuriates him. In the meantime, word spreads among pilgrims in the tent city that Jesus is working miracles, and the gathering starts to swell. The parents and the blind man are brought into the synagogue to be questioned. His parents shy away from disagreement. In compliance with the decree, they cast the man out of the synagogue when he refuses to denounce Jesus and maintains that he has manifestly performed a miracle and must be the work of God. Jesus begins to teach as the crowd swells, largely based on Luke 11:27-53. Jesus pushes back and starts criticizing the Pharisees for being overly fixated on ritual purity and man-made tradition and undervaluing inner purity and God's law. He refuses to continue performing signs for them, claiming that they are an unbeliever generation that will eventually receive the sign of Jonah. Rabbi Akiva and his follower object. He calls them out for being unduly preoccupied with getting good seats and being respected by the audience. The crowd becomes unruly as a result, intensifying the confrontation to a breaking point. Quintus shows up and makes vain attempts to put an end to the fighting. At last, Jesus consents to depart after the disciples have planned a way out. However, while making his getaway, Rama is split up from the other followers. Everyone flees after Quintus stabs her before they can get to her, with the exception of Jesus, who arrives to console Thomas but not to heal her. Zebedee's unique anointing oil is becoming more and more popular, but James and John are gloomy. They explain how Jesus gave Simon a new name and seemed to elevate him above the other disciples when Zebedee and Salome question them. Outraged, Salome argues that James and John ought to get an equal part of the kingdom's benefits and influence because they have contributed significantly more to Jesus than has Simon. She makes the case that all they have to do is ask Jesus to grant them a greater position or rank in the kingdom, recalling how he stated, "Ask, and it will be given to you." Matthew 7:7. Zebedee tries to resist, but the brothers are not sure they should. James and John, however, agree to ask themselves when Salome continues to insist that if they don't ask, she will. This is a clever nod to how Salome is the one who asks Jesus to elevate her sons in the Gospel of Matthew 20:20, while in the parallel story in the Gospel of Mark 10:35, the sons ask him directly. Later on, the two argue over when and what specifically they should ask Jesus for. The Pharisees decide not to bring their request to Jesus until later during their public dispute with him. Big James' vindictive streak is sparked after Quintus stabs Rama. He pulls a knife and tries to retaliate. Luckily, John has the ability to control his sibling. Once more, my criticisms regarding the tempo, little characters, and production value from my evaluation of Episode 1 still hold true. When a number of lesser narratives are going on at the same time, such as in Season 1 Episode 6, Season 3 Episode 5, or Season 3 Episode 6, the writers of The Chosen always do a terrific job with chaotic crowd situations involving Jesus lecturing. Because there is so much movement during these events, they are able to communicate a lot of biblical lessons without the time appearing didactic. These instances also give several tales the chance to intersect in dramatic and fascinating ways. A lot of people thought Rama would die. It wasn't entirely unexpected, but that's okay with me because the show hinted at it quite a bit. For example, when Rama and Thomas talked about time and how they wanted to be together forever. Surprise is a cheap ploy that is rarely perceived as valuable. It's important to me that the moment worked, which I believe it did, and that it will take the characters, especially Thomas, Quintus, and Gaius, in intriguing new areas while also advancing the season's overarching themes. Jonathan Rumi's criticism of the Pharisees undoubtedly reflected a different energy, one that is indicative of a change in his perspective as he becomes more aware of the end and becomes irritated with his people's persistent blindness. The opening of OT was excellent. It also worked as a deft example of misdirection and foreshadowing. I saw the tape as an anti-parallel foreshadowing Gaius' son's healing because it featured a parent hoping to heal his ailing son. Rather, it hinted only to the truth that God doesn't always cure, and it can be difficult to figure out why. We are prompted to reflect on why God appears to grant certain requests for healing and salvation, but not others by the story of David and Bathsheba. David is at a loss for words when Bathsheba asks him this question. This is a really strong scriptural answer. Oftentimes, Christians overestimate their ability to comprehend God's intentions based on an understandable desire to justify God's activities or formulate a thorough and organized theory. This appears to be the way of thinking for the observer who wonders if Uzziah's blindness was caused by his own crimes or his parents' sins. He doesn't appear to be doing maliciously. It seems to me that he is merely attempting to comprehend the world more fully, to the extent that he can ask Jesus a question in terms of a straightforward binary. He misunderstands the circumstances and believes he knows them far better than he actually does. Jesus rejects the dichotomy and presents a third viewpoint, stating that Uzziah's blindness was a divine intervention meant to eventually heal him and bring glory to God via Jesus. Of course, this unexpected third choice was beyond the observer's comprehension, but that was kind of the purpose. God frequently behaves in ways that are unexpected and incomprehensible as he is much beyond our comprehension. God hasn't specifically put himself in a box, therefore we must be careful not to set restrictions on him or his acts. If the last line sounds familiar to you, it's because Nicodemus used it to characterize the narrow-minded perspective of many Pharisees in Season 1. And in Season 4's third episode, we witness Pharisees maintaining the same mindset. His assumption is that Jesus must be a false prophet or necromancer since he does things like heal on Shabbat, and says things like criticizing the value of ritual purity above a pure heart. that contradict his own conception of God. He is oblivious to Jesus' alternative options and ways as well as God's work. However, because he has an open mind, Uzziah is able to see and react to God's unique and enigmatic ways in an open and honest manner. There has been a great deal of discussion about Ramah's passing and Jesus' choice to not heal her. Would Jesus decline to work a miracle that would save the life of one of his own disciples? Jesus had refused to heal in the chosen on previous occasions. In the third season, Jesus tells little James that he is not healed so that he might demonstrate to others that Jesus is worthy of being followed even in the absence of the ability to heal. Just that it's not yet Ramadan has been the extent of Jesus' explanation to us at this particular juncture. According to Matthew 27:51-53, this suggests that Jesus understood that Ramah's healing will not occur until after his resurrection, or possibly even before his crucifixion. Viewers may not find my explanation to be satisfactory, but I believe that's part of the idea. It is nearly always exceedingly frustrating for us as humans when God/Jesus acts in strange ways and doesn't act in the way we anticipate. We want God to act in a predictable manner. Still, the God of the Bible, of the chosen, and of everyday life is no gentle lion. He is transcendent and omnipotent. He makes promises we can rely on, therefore that doesn't imply he is arbitrary and entirely unpredictable. Nevertheless, overcoming the doubts and disappointments that surface when God's plan diverges from our original intentions is a necessary step in growing in faith. The confrontation between the Pharisees and Jesus reaches unprecedented heights in episode 3. Once he knew about the decree against him, Jesus may take a little time to retreat or perhaps leave the area to diffuse the situation. Gaius advises Matthew to do just that. Given how tense things are, even Simon Peter is uncomfortable and shows concern about Jesus' choice to teach in public. Instead of calming things down, Jesus decides to take a risk and heals a man in front of a synagogue on a Sabbath when a Pharisee is present. And when the Pharisees emerge to confront him in front of an assembling multitude, Jesus doesn't back down or hold back. Instead, he launches one of the most direct and severe attacks on the Pharisees that we have seen thus far. Even though Jesus is occasionally gentle, he is also not afraid to provoke people when needed, especially when it comes to disputes with religious authorities. Both the struggle with Rome and the conflict with the Pharisees are intensified by this discourse. Jesus didn't need extrasensory awareness to realize that attracting a sizable crowd and having a contentious public argument would undoubtedly attract Rome's attention and wrath. While the Pharisees' leadership is the target of Jesus' words, his acts also seem to be criticizing the authority and system of the Roman government. Even if Quintus' victim is unexpected, the violence's eruption is not all that shocking. Saying that Jesus is inciting conflict with Rome may be overstating the case, but he most definitely does not let conflict anxiety stop him from sharing the message that God has put on his heart. If the OT prologue to episode 3 was meant merely to encourage reflection on God's enigmatic intent, then a scenario from the book of Job would have made more sense, since it alludes to a further major issue in the episode, namely the perilous temptations that face people in positions of authority or who aspire to them. The death of David's kid has been included. The youngster of Bathsheba is not unintentionally unwell. By removing Bathsheba from her legitimate husband and subjecting him to a brutal death, David abused his royal authority, and the baby's death is intended as retribution. David, who was formerly the victim of a cruel and tyrannical monarch, has forgotten that God gave him power and needs to be made completely helpless in order to change his perspective on power and turn to God for forgiveness. Following this somber opening scene, we see Quintus going on the rampage and harassing businesses, beggars, and even his own soldiers. We quickly find out that the pilgrims from Tent City have finally started to reduce his tax collection, which has been the only thing maintaining him in Rome's good graces. Quintus' predicament serves as an example of how unstable earthly power is by nature and how powerful people frequently resort to violence and intimidation to hold on to their position of authority. Quintus threatens to deprive Gaius of his title or worse if he doesn't forcefully shrink the tent city, and this temptation presents itself to Gaius once again. He needs to decide if he will, like Quintus, abuse the pilgrims and Jesus' adherents in order to hold on to his position, or if he will resist doing so, even if it means sacrificing his own authority and power. Everything here builds to the confrontation in the episode's climactic scene. Quintus' power and control are shown to be unstable once again by the disruption caused by Jesus' argument with the Pharisees. And once more, we witness Quintus attempt to regain control by threats and violence. However, Gaius declines to cling to authority. Rather than employing force to seize control of the situation, he just watches passively. He refuses to comply with Quintus's command to arrest Jesus, even though he knows that doing so would require giving up his own authority, status, and even freedom. However, the episode presents an unexpected turnabout. Quintus's violent attempt to take over finally results in Atticus arresting him for Rama's death. But Gaius succeeds in his mission, which is to remove his insane boss. Thus, we observe that those who abuse and cling to authority frequently lose it. All people who are prepared to give up power frequently get even more, a very biblical paradox. Not just people outside of the church are at risk from power. We witness Solomon, Big James, and John, their mother, battling an abnormal need for dominance and power. This excessive desire is frequently concealed within the church under ecclesiastical terminology and various pretexts, many of which are evident in the discourse in Zebedee's home. Arguments based on comparative merit, confusing one's own aspirations with furthering God's goals, etc. While the outcome of Big James' excessive thirst for power is not revealed in episode 3, we do get a glimpse of how it has tainted his heart. Big James is the only one among the disciples who tries to take physical revenge on Quintus. This incident seems to indicate that James has adopted a Gentile-style perspective on power that is contrary to what Jesus taught. This thread will most likely be examined in more detail as Season 4 goes on.